Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. I'm just tying in this clematis. It's one called Comtesse de Bouchard, and it's one of the late flowering clematis, group 3, they're categorized in. And what distinguishes them is that they put on masses of growth from spring. So this was pruned right back down to the ground in March, and it's the new growth that produces the flowers. Now, you do have to keep tying that in, although pretty much by now, the tendrils are clinging on to whatever support you have. I've got it growing up a wigwam in the border, but you could just as easily grow it in a container or against a trellis or the wall of your house. And now that it's started flowering, and the end of June, beginning of July is normally when this happens, this will continue to produce these fabulous mauvey pink flowers right through till September. And that's what I love about the group 3 clematis. They're tough, they grow in almost any soil, in any position, and all they do is just flower their hearts out all summer long. On today's programme, Kate Bradbury shares her top plants for attracting wildlife into the garden.
This rambling rose is already providing shelter for insects. I've just found 2 night-flying moths, including this beautiful elephant hawk moth here.
And there's another chance to join Rachel on a visit she made to the glorious Kiftsgate Court Gardens in the Cotswolds.
It is absolutely beautiful, rather like falling into a box of chocolates and finding something delicious in every corner.
And I shall be creating a summer display in a container. This, literally, is the high point of the garden. It's only about 5-6 feet up, but the rest of the garden lies below it because this is the mound. And we replanted it about 3 or 4 years ago, taking our colour theme as pale yellows and whites. We've got plants like the amimagus, the rose Alba semiplena. We've got the white foxgloves, and then the yellow is mainly coming at this time of year from the roses. We've got Vanessa Bell, we've got the climber, Morven Hills, which actually is a rambler, not a climber, but it's really quite constrained, so very good for a smaller space. And growing up this corner, I planted a wisteria. Now, like most wisterias, it didn't flower for the first few years, so don't worry if your wisteria takes a little while to start flowering. But it did produce lovely white racemes of flower this spring. The time to prune a wisteria, whether it's young like this one or it's been there for decades, is immediately after flowering. So July, the beginning of July, the end of June is perfect. Now, if you've got a young one like this, it's just sprawling and growing, so all my efforts are to create a structure that I hope will go right along the front here and along that side, and then it'll just be draped with flowers every year. So looking at this, for example, I actually want this to go left and along that side. So I want to keep that. And I might want to train this up, but actually I also have another good strong growth above. So I could take this off. It's a very forgiving plant because you can cut it back very hard and it will regrow. Okay, I'm going to tie that in. And if you've got a wisteria that is very overgrown, cut back till you've got a structure that doesn't stick out too much, and then next year it will not only flower well, but be a much better shape. You will need to get back up to do some tying in, round about the end of August, early September, when you've had a couple of months of good growth so that it doesn't get whipped about and possibly broken by the winter weather. Now, you can take cuttings from climbers, almost any climber, but I know some people feel a little timid about this and a little uncertain about the best way to do it. So, if you feel that you need some guidance, there is no better teacher than Carol.
You might remember that last time you were here, we took some salvia cuttings, and I'm thrilled to say that they've all rooted. Just look at these cuttings. They look happy, healthy. I could see some roots just peeking out at the bottom, and I know that they're ready. So I'm just very, very carefully going to turn the whole thing out. Look at that. Beautiful roots, really lovely. Now, what's important is that you don't destroy any of those roots. So I'm just pushing my thumbs into the middle and just pulling them apart, teasing them apart very, very gently. Because now that they've gone to the trouble of making those roots, I don't want to break any of them. So I'm just using old pots, and I'm actually reusing some old compost because salvias don't need anything rich anyway. It's open, it's gritty, and it's got lots of loam in it. That's what's important. So it will sustain them for the few weeks it'll take for the roots to fill that pot and for them to become plants of their own. So in we go. Just make sure that you firm it down very gently at first. Just shake it down, and then the obligatory grit on the top. That'll help retain moisture, stop any weeds growing. I don't think they're going to rot anyway, but it'll make sure that they don't, because these stems now are nice and firm. I hope you've had success with yours, but if you haven't, don't worry, just have another go. All sorts of little things can go wrong, and it's really worth persisting. Now I'm going to give these cuttings a thorough watering, they deserve it. They want to be drenched. After that, they should look after themselves. You can keep them outside in a nice sheltered place and keep on checking, and eventually you'll find that they're really putting on growth, and then it's time to put them out. That'll only take a few weeks. You'll have flowers all summer long. So now we've had success with our salvias, it's time to move things up a notch. I'm going to look for some material to take some cuttings to make new climbers. I haven't actually brought this water for me, even though I'm thirsty. It's for the material that I'm going to collect from this honeysuckle. This is the one I want to propagate. It's called Graham Thomas. It's a form of periclymenum, which is our own native honeysuckle. It's white and cream and gorgeous, and it flowers profusely. So the first job when you're taking cuttings is to select the best material. Now this is a lovely, big, vigorous shoot, but you can see there's a great expanse between these leaf nodes, the places where these leaves actually come out from the stem. So they're not ideal at all because you get a very long cutting with just a little bit of leaf on the top. And I think instead, there are a couple of these shorter pieces, and they've also got much, much shorter space between these leaf nodes. And that's absolutely ideal. And immediately, I'm just going to put that in water. Plenty of material there. So up to my bench and we'll start work. First of all, we'll start off really sharp knife. If you don't like using a knife, then make sure that your secateurs are really sharp, because what you don't want to do is crush the stem. I'm cutting just below a leaf node, where the hormones that promote new root growth are concentrated. And then I'm going to take off those bottom leaves. And then go up one, go up two, to 2 pairs of leaves above that, and cut right across that top bit too. And then straight into your pot, push it down right the way to that bottom pair of leaves. Next one, just move the whole thing round. Then some grit on the top. Now, time to give you a drink. This is of a lovely clematis called Olympia. So even though I've neglected it in the past, I'm going to make up to it, aren't I? Eh? Yeah. And I'm going to take some internodal cuttings from it, and Sylvie's going to help me. Internodal cuttings are taken between leaf nodes, so new roots have to grow from normal stem cells. They'll take a bit longer to root, but you can make more cuttings from your material. So here I go. Above this leaf node, still leaving those 2 leaves, and then I'm going to cut between that and the next one. So I've just got a nice short cutting, it's just a couple of inches long, and then I've got those 2 leaves, one on either side, and I've cut just above it. I'm just going to scrape just a skinny layer off there, exposing this more green wood. And then I want to push that right into the top, same gritty compost mix, right down to those leaves, so it's just sitting on the top of the compost. Then some grit on the top, once again. And then a really, really good watering. Now, it could be that you haven't got clematis and honeysuckle in your garden, but never fear, it's not too late to introduce plants that climb and reach for the sky. I've got some ipomea seed. These are annual climbers, and some of them are spectacular. I've been soaking a few of the seeds overnight because that helps them to germinate really rapidly. Each seed can be taken individually because they're quite big, and you give each one its own space. But what I actually prefer to do is to give each one its own separate compartment. That means once it's germinated and it starts to climb, you can give it some little support in there, get it going, and then when you transplant it to its proper position, it's not going to know anything about it at all. There'll be no root disturbance whatsoever. I'm going to get a visit from the cat. I knew I would. You're very curious today, aren't you? Don't eat these seeds, though. Not good for you. And I expect to see germination from these within a couple of weeks or so. And as soon as they've germinated, they seem to take off. So easy, so simple, and so rewarding. Some grit, a good drink, then they'll need to be put somewhere warm and light. As well as exotic climbers, don't forget that more familiar favourite, the sweet pea. It's very late to sow seeds, but worth a try. Once they've made little plants, get them outside with something to climb up. You should get flowers by the end of August, the beginning of September. It's so worth doing because the glory of having plants that climb and fill the air with that gorgeous perfume just can't be beaten.
Of course, Carol is absolutely right that climbers transform any garden, and the great thing about them is that it doesn't matter how tall they grow, they only take up the space of their footprint. So even the smallest garden can have dramatic climbers. And I've got a couple of climbers here that I want to put up this support. And these are special for 2 reasons. One, because they are a tropical plant. This is Cobea scandens, the cup and saucer vine, and they have these big bell-shaped flowers quite late on in the year. They start to flower in July, but will carry on until they're killed by the frosts. The other special thing about these 2 particular plants is that they have been grown from seed collected from the Cobea that we grew last year. In other words, they are Longmeadow Cobea scandens, and we'll collect seeds from these and we'll keep the strain going. Now, these are very vigorous. Although they're annuals, they really can grow big if they're given good soil and plenty of sunshine. And they will flower profusely. So very dramatic. But what I'm going to do is plant one at this end and one at the other end and let it clamber over the espalier pear. I'll just knock that out. Got a good root system. So we will pop that in the ground. If you can give it good soil with richness but also drainage, it doesn't want to sit in a quagmire, and sunshine, then you will maximize its flowering potential. Right, that's already halfway up, and that will completely cover this space. Now, these will need a good soak, and then watering once a week, unless there's heavy rainfall. Now, height is always a good thing in the garden, and we had this film sent to us by Birgit Ackroyd, which shows that it doesn't just have to come from climbers.
Hello, Gardener's World. My name is Birgit. I'm Swedish. I live in Cowes on the Isle of Wight, and I've been gardening ever since I moved here 22 years ago. This video is about how you can bring height to your garden in a very small garden, a very small space, without planting big trees. You can use wonderful big pots. This birch here has been in this pot for years. It's got big drain holes, and I think that the roots now have gone down into the ground, but it's no way that I would want a 20-metre birch planted in my garden. Also, here's a mimosa tree. That was a yellow cloud in February, full of mimosa flowers, also in a bin. And then I underplant. There's a knautia, there's a rose, there's some nasturtiums this year. As we go back up the garden again, we have my fig tree with lots of figs on it, and that's in a very small pot to restrict it, but it's actually growing very well, and I think I've got about 25 figs on here now. This is the pineapple tree. It smells beautiful here, gives off a very, very good fragrance. You can see that you can add height in the garden wherever you want by actually planting in really big pots, and they cost nothing. They're very light. You can put stones in the bottom to hold them down and drill them, and you get all this height. Thank you.
Well, I do agree with Birgit that height transforms any garden of any kind, however big or small. And I love the idea of growing trees in pots. Now, this raised bed is empty because we finished the lettuce that I grew in here from spring. And the key to keeping lots of vegetables coming through is to use the space as well as possible. So while the lettuce were growing, I sowed some celery, and now they're ready to plant out. And I've got two different types here. These ones are self-blanching. It's a variety called Celebrity. And then we've got a variety called Giant Red, which is a trench celery. Now, trench celery is what I was brought up on growing. You dig a trench, and then you put the plants out into the base of the trench and gradually earth them up as they grew so that the stems would be sweet and tender. Whereas self-blanching celery, you just plant in a grid on the surface, and as they grow, they shield each other and keep the light out, and that keeps them sweet and edible. And if you're a little bit short of space, I would always go for self-blanching type. And that's what I'm going to plant actually here on this raised bed, and I will plant these in the other vegetable garden. Now, the sort of spacing you need is wide enough so they have room to grow, but close enough so that when they do grow, they protect each other. So if I put one in the corner here, like that, there we go. That's the sort of distance I'm looking at. About 6 inches to 9 inches apart. And as I say, grow them in a grid always, not rows, because you don't want light to get to the stems. So we'll put that one there like that. Celery is one of those vegetables that people either love or hate. I love them. And it stores quite well in winter. These will go on probably till Christmas time, unless it's really cold. Although trench celery does keep better because it's insulated from the cold by the soil that's all around it. It's actually part of the carrot family. So when you're growing them in a rotation, just think of growing them alongside carrots or parsnips or parsley. They're all members of the same group. Now, celery, whether it's trench or soft blanching, needs rich, well-drained soil and plenty of water. This is not a plant that copes well with drought. If they show any sign of going to seed, it's nearly always because they're too dry. And these should be ready to start harvesting towards the end of August, and then especially in September and October. When I finish planting these, I will give them a really good soak. And if it stays dry, I will make sure that they have a thorough soak at least once a week. Now, it's always good to go back and revisit a garden that you've seen before and enjoyed. And now we've got the chance to return to Chigwell in Essex and have another look at a garden that is truly magical.
It starts like a painting. It's just a splash of color. And after the plant gets more and more detail, and this don't stop.
Before the garden was totally renovated, it was basically a concrete patio. Fabrice then came and stayed here, and I did say to him that I would love my garden improving. So he totally renovated the garden, as you could say, in lieu of rent.
Well, it was funny. The first night I spent in this house, I was thinking about the garden, and I was a little bit lost because this was really a very small garden. And I went to bed, and in the middle of the night, I wake up with terrible headache, and it was a plan coming in my head. On my plan, I like the fact to have different sitting areas, and it makes the garden feel much bigger. The garden is an extension of the house, and actually it's the most important part of the house. On the top level, I wanted to have as much room as possible.
On the patio, it's nice to sit in the evening because you've got the sun facing you and you've still got the ambience of the garden to look at. On the next level down, we've got two old wooden seats.
I put the chair in each side of this level only for one reason. I detest to have a conversation with someone and to have to turn my head. I like to be face to face. And plus, we still have some room in the middle to be able to have a table and drinks, whatever. But I like to have my guests in front of me. This area, I wanted to create some sort of background and try to have a little bit of height, but to keep everything in proportion in the garden. An example, this tree, I want to keep it to a certain height, just enough to have privacy, but not to have it like a wall.
The next level down is what we call the secret area because you are quite hidden from other houses.
I cannot imagine any garden without water because it brings peace. It is very atmospheric when we sit in the garden having conversation, watching the bird on top of the fountain. The secret area is one of my favorite spots. It's where I can forget everything that is around. The plants in this area, I really like them, particularly the colocasia. It's beautiful, and in the morning with all the drop of water, it's like little pearl floating on top. The same with the oyster.
There are several interesting items in the garden. We have 5 what we call pinnacles, which are the remains of old trees which were flooded many years ago.
For me, the pinnacles, they are a piece of art that have been created by nature, and sometimes they are the most beautiful. What makes it work, it's all bits and pieces, it's like a puzzle. They all go together, and I cannot imagine to remove one of them.
I never thought I'd have a garden like this. I mean, it's fantastic.
I love this garden because it's a place where I can breathe. It can be extremely peaceful and serene. Choose.
Turpin's Lane is part of the National Garden Scheme, and you can visit it, and they are planning to open just as soon as they are allowed to. For more information about the NGS and which gardens may be open now or opening soon in your area, visit our website. Now, these are all chilies, and the reason why I'm now growing so many chilies is because last year I discovered that you can freeze them. You simply harvest them when they're ripe and put them straight in the freezer. I just put them in small bags. And then when you take them out and defrost them, you have a ripe chili. And the whole point about that is it retains its fruitiness. And you lose that if you dry them. So if you've got a freezer and you've got a greenhouse, grow some chilies. Now, still to come on today's programme. We pay a visit to Kate Bradbury's garden in Brighton as she shares her top plants for creating a wildlife haven. But first, we go to Rutland to visit the home of Matthew Rumbelow. Now, Matthew is a lover of roses, and this is something that runs in his family.
Hello, and welcome to our garden. Today, I'd like to tell you all about our roses and why they're so important to me. Back in 2013, my dad sadly passed away, and when we sold his house, it was clear that the new owners were going to take on a pretty big renovation project. Unfortunately, the garden, which had been my parents' pride and joy, quickly turned into something of a wilderness come building site. So late one winter's evening, I decided I was going to go over and ask if I could rescue his roses. I dug up about 12 mature rose bushes and threw them in the boot of the car. Well, I'm pleased to say that every single one of those bushes took. So anyway, without further ado, here they are. This one's a lovely cream. I unfortunately have no idea what any of the varieties are, but they're all doing really, really well. This one is an absolute beauty, and certainly I think one of my favourites. It has an incredible smell, really, really heavy scent. One thing I learned from all my years watching Gardener's World as a child was that roses are very hungry plants, so it's very important every year to make sure that they're mulched with a good compost. It's amazing to think that the rose bushes that were in the garden when I grew up are now in my garden. It's a lovely way to remember both my mum and dad, and I just wish they could be here to see them.
I think it's really special if, like Matthew, you can grow plants that you know were loved and treasured by your parents. Matthew's roses look to me as though they're all hybrid teas, and they will flower these big, voluptuous blooms all summer long. All the roses here in the cottage garden are old shrub roses, and the big difference is that these have one glorious period of display that lasts about 4 weeks in June and July. However, some of them, like this one here, which is Chapeau de Napoleon, which is a centifolia rose, have a mass of petals. But if you have wet weather at this time of year, particularly if it's interspersed with blasts of hot sunshine, then they stay closed and the outer petals form a kind of hard casing and the flowers can never open. And that's called balling. And this is a pretty good example. So you can see that it's swollen, but it hasn't opened out. And if I just gently tease it apart like that, just to release the flower that's within, you can see that open in front of your eyes, and that's coming alive. And I would stress that this is particularly a problem of centifolias and those roses that have mass petals. The simpler the petal, the less likely it is to happen. Now, last year, Rachel paid a visit to Kiftsgate Court Gardens in Gloucestershire. And those of us who grow roses immediately think of the Kiftsgate rose because it is famously an enormous rambler, the biggest in the country by far. But, as Rachel discovered, there is a lot more to Kiftsgate Court Gardens than one giant rose.
Winding woodland terraces, meandering borders, a series of small gardens, each with their own individual personalities. It's a joyful place to be. But it's the story of the women behind Kiftsgate that's really captured my imagination. 3 generations of women spanning a century, each of whom adding to the story that's made this garden possible. The first of this trio of gardeners was Heather Muir, who established the garden layout after the First World War. She wasn't a trained gardener, but she definitely had her own ideas. Her vision was to create a relaxed and natural style, totally different to the regimented style of the day. This square is divided into 4 sections. I can't tell you, it really takes your breath away when you walk down into it. And I think Heather had such a talent for putting together colours. They really flow. And she also was very much, I think, ahead of her time in that she mixed together shrubs with perennials. At the beginning of the 20th century, most people would have had a shrubbery and then a separate herbaceous border. So this was really ahead of its time. It is absolutely beautiful, rather like falling into a box of chocolates and finding something delicious in every corner. Then in this area, you walk past more of Heather's beautiful planting, past the hybrid musk rose called Felicia, the fantastic perfume, and that was planted in the 1930s. And then you come out into this section, and wow, what a view. Today, her granddaughter Anne, together with her husband, has taken the reins and embraced her grandmother's vision. Your grandmother sounds extraordinary and very much her own woman.
Yes, I think she was. My mum always said that she had a very strong character. In fact, we've all got rather strong characters. She really planned the garden without putting anything on plan, just by looking at the space, planting the hedges, dividing up the areas, and that's pretty remarkable, really.
And where did that inspiration come from?
I think she'd grown up in a garden. Her parents were keen gardeners, so maybe it was in the blood. She'd had no horticultural experience. None of us have, so she just had to learn on the job.
Yes, best way of learning, I think.
Yes, you learn with your mistakes.
Now we're walking along this avenue of Rosamunde, just so beautiful, I can't describe.
This was planted by my grandmother, this rose hedge, so way back in the 1930s. And she cut it very hard, and we do as well. She used to take shears to it and literally just sort of chop it.
Which is how it's treated now, actually,
yes.
much more. People aren't so precious about the roses.
And it flowers incredibly well every year. You can see how we train the other roses on sort of different supports so that you get the best from the flowers.
Yes, that's lovely, isn't it? So you bend the stem down and then it breaks
exactly, rather than
to
just let them all grow in a sort of heap.
And of course, one can't help now but notice this most beautiful rose. I'm assuming Kiftsgate.
Yes, it is. I mean, a complete monster, really, climbing to the top of the trees and covering a vast area. But it is spectacular when it's in flower like this, sort of a waterfall of white heads.
It's just a sort of glorious monster. In 1954, Anne's mother, Diney, was lured back from London life by her grandmother, Heather, to take over the garden. This wonderfully sinuous border, I mean, it's a really interesting take on a very classic feature, usually straight lines. So who was responsible for...
Well, my grandmother laid out the border, and my mum actually added a lot to it as well. She was a great plants woman, absolutely adored gardening. I mean, as a child, I just sort of remember we couldn't find her. We knew she'd be upside down in the border somewhere, so we had to just sort of shout and find her. But she really spent hours in the garden.
So what are some of the things here that she added?
Marie Simon, these are the deciduous summer-flowering ceanothus, as against the evergreen blue ones that you know sort of in the spring, and that they actually add a lot at this time of year. We don't prune them until the spring, just in case it's a bad winter. They seem to thrive here.
And a great melding plant, you know, sort of softens things like the roses and so on.
Yes, very good sort of mixture with the roses. Then, of course, here, the little bush honeysuckle, and it just grows into that sort of small bush shape. It's not a climber. And people always sort of comment, how do you keep your kind of honeysuckles that shape? But it just does it.
Anne followed in her mother and grandmother's footsteps, putting her own mark on the garden. She's created wilder areas because she's very keen to bring in nature, which feels very different to the established gardens. And there's something else.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow. Just when you're beginning to feel you've got the measure of Kiftsgate, something completely different. Is this Anne in the garden?
Well, it's me and Johnny, my husband, because he helped do the plans for this. And we wanted something very simple and contemporary. We had the lovely big yew hedges, and then we also decided that we needed some height. But we liked the simplicity of the stainless steel stems and the gilded bronze philodendron leaves, and the water just runs up them on a sort of timer.
It's such a lovely contrast to the rest of the garden. Do you feel that you've had an enormous responsibility in inheriting this incredible garden?
Yes, I mean, when Johnny and I first moved down, we really knew nothing. We had to learn from my mother. It's been our life, really, for 30 years, and we've loved it.
One garden, 3 female gardeners, each putting their own unique stamp on it, all uniting in the vision of a place where plants and spaces can blend and flow in perfect harmony.
Well, watching that has certainly made me want to go back and revisit Kiftsgate, which I haven't done for far too long. And we all can now, because the gardens have reopened, and if you go to our website, you'll get all the details of ours, so there's no excuse. It's a wonderful garden. Now, I have a rose here destined for the jewel garden. It's called Thomas à Becket. I've chosen it because it's got really good bright colour. It's an English rose. And it's actually quite atypical of the English roses because it's quite loose in habit, the flowers are fairly open and will work well amongst the hurly-burly softness of the jewel garden in its full summer glory. but I'm not going to put it in there now, because although it will work well in there, I think it's going to struggle to get established. I've often found with roses, if you plant them into a mixed border when they're small, they can really struggle to fight off the competition from surrounding plants. So I'm going to put this on and give it a gap year where it can grow bigger and stronger, and then it can go in the dual garden. However, I'm going to make a virtue of that and create a summer display in a container so it can do its growing, but we can admire and enjoy it at the same time. Now, you do need a fairly large pot because roses need depth in which to get their roots growing. I've mixed up a barrow of compost, coir-based compost, and I've added sieve garden compost, some leaf mould, and a bit of perlite. Now, you can see that the pot is about a third full. There's a decent amount of compost underneath for the roots to get down and get really strong. And just remember that a plant is only as healthy and as vigorous as its roots. I'm setting it down below the surface of the pot because I want to leave plenty of room for water. And it never hurts to plant a rose a little bit too deep because you don't want the graft point above the surface of the soil. As you can see, the plants that I've chosen to go along with the rose are fuchsias. There is one called Maxima, which I like because it's got a slightly glaucous leaf with this deep plum-coloured petal and then the pink which picks up off the rose. It's not wholly hardy. I bring fuchsias in winter and just keep them frost-free and then cut them back really hard at the beginning of April, and so you get new growth which will give you new flowers. So I'm going to put 4, I think, in here. Fuchsias really like semi-shade, and one of the good things about Thomas à Becket rose is that it will grow in shade. So we'll put that in there like that, and then put soil around them. If you've got any leaf mould, fuchsias are a plant that just love it. Now, like all plants in a container in summer, this will need to be kept watered. Now, this is a temporary affair, which we can enjoy all summer. But in our garden in Brighton, Cape Bradbury has created a permanent wildlife haven.
When I began making my wildlife garden last year, I knew it would be exciting, but I had no idea how fast it would grow from a barren, boring plot into my own wildlife haven. It's all happened so quickly. I've got about 18 species of birds coming in. I've got frogs in the pond. I've got 4 types of solitary bee in my bee hotel and more insects than I can even identify in the meadow. And I've got about 5 hedgehogs that are coming in at night, and I'm pretty sure I've got one nesting just by the side of the shed because I pick her up on the trail cameras scuttling into a hole. The key to enticing all that wildlife in my garden starts at the bottom of the food chain with insects. Get them in and everyone else comes in to feed on them. Like all wildlife, insects need somewhere to rest, feed and breed. And in a small garden, it's a really good idea to grow plants to provide 2 or even 3 of those roles. I'm going to show you which plants have worked the best for me in this garden. As gardeners, it's likely you'll have many already, or something doing a similar job. Because when it's too blustery to fly, when it's raining, or when they simply need to rest, butterflies, bees and moths use plants to hide in. And climbers are particularly good at providing this shelter, even if they're small. This rambling rose, Francis E. Leicester, which is only 18 months old and still has plenty of fence to climb, is already providing shelter for insects. I've just found 2 night-flying moths, including this beautiful elephant hawk moth here. And this one, called the lime speck pug, both resting up before they fly again tonight. Caught in a shower, insects will use flowers as umbrellas too. And it's even better if those flowers can provide a good meal.
Most insects don't really care where their nectar comes from, but there are a few favourites that flower over a long period, and I love them too. There's Naughty and Macedonica in the foreground, which flowers for weeks in early summer.
Perennial wallflowers flower here from spring to the first frost, and sometimes right through to January. This dye's chamomile, or Anthemis tinctoria, is very popular. Last year, my leafcutter bees even used the petals to seal up their nests. Catmint, or Nepeta, flowers for months too, with its short, tubey flowers. And this clover, Trifolium rubens, is also a favourite. As insects have different length tongues and mouth parts, growing different shapes of flowers is important.
Having something in flower from February to November, or even December if you can, just provides the longest season of nectar and pollen throughout the year, which just means you cater for the widest range of insects.
Most flowers take hours to refill their nectaries once the insects have fed.
This, though, is a nectar machine. Studies have shown that borage flowers refill with nectar every 2 minutes. So bees and other insects can rely on borage for a constant source of nectar throughout the day. Comfrey is another really good one, which refills every 40 minutes. But if you want something that refills really quickly, especially if you've got a small garden, you can't beat borage.
Though many bedding plants have been bred for extra petals and therefore don't produce much pollen or nectar, there are ones that do. Snapdragons are much loved by heavier bumblebees who've evolved to weigh down that big petal lip. Violas are great all-rounders. And the dianthus, it's not a great bee plant, but it looks good here. When it comes to plants for breeding on, some insects can be fussier, as they've evolved to lay eggs on just a few plants and their caterpillars can't survive on anything else.
So that's why I let this little patch of garlic mustard grow at the back of this border. Its flowers are all right, it's got quite pretty leaves, but I mainly grow it as a caterpillar food plant for the orange tip butterfly.
The orange tip is very common in gardens, and the hungry caterpillar needs those specific leaves to ensure it can grow and eventually fly.
It's not just caterpillars that benefit from garlic mustard. There's a whole world of insects living among these leaves. I've just found a ladybird larvae struggling really hard to eat an entire aphid.
Orange tips can lay eggs on honesty and cuckoo flower too, but the easiest plants to grow for other butterflies must be nettles. They tend to prefer big clumps in sunshine, but even smaller, shadier clumps are often popular with moths.
I know these nettles are being used because some of these leaves here are folded over, and beneath each leaf fold will be a tiny little caterpillar sheltering itself from predators.
There's also telltale signs of munching on the leaves, and these are all round the garden. Foxgloves are great for caterpillars, and so are hazel and honeysuckle.
The irony is, you'd be hard-pressed to find a caterpillar in this garden because all the birds have come in and taken them to feed their young. And that's what I love about wildlife gardening. All the plants I've grown for the caterpillars and the aphids and the leaf miners and all the other grubs are just serving species further up the food chain. And that's why I've got the birds and the hedgehogs and the frogs. I never imagined the wildlife would come in so quickly, but the fact that it has makes me really, really happy.
Come on in.
Last time I spoke to Kate, she was beginning to create this garden and was so full of enthusiasm and knowledge for it. So I'm so glad that it's worked out so well. But I also know that if you make it, they will come. This pond, for example, we only began at the end of February, and already birds come down to use it, dragonflies are starting to appear, and I'm sure next spring the frogs will find it and lay their spawn, and we'll get tadpoles. I had fully intended today to plant this water lily. It's an Nymphaea alba, the native water lily, and I was going to pot it up, go down, put it in the deep part of the water, but unfortunately hurt my back, and I really don't trust myself to slip and slide down in the water and holding on to a plant. I will leave it in the bucket, submerged. However, I have got some marginal plants that I can put in. These are calla lilies, and these white calla lilies, Xanthodeschia ethiopica, are really semi-aquatic plants, and they will grow very happily at the edge of a pond so that they're permanently wet. If you've got the coloured calla lilies, they will grow perfectly well in ordinary soil, and they're not really aquatic plants at all. But if you grow this in soil, you do need to make sure that it doesn't dry out. It likes to be moist. And I'm just going to place it, pot and all, along the margin here. They can go in water as shallow as 6 inches and no deeper than about a foot or so. And by keeping it in the pot, it means that when the frosts come in autumn, I can just lift it out and take it into the greenhouse, because these are not reliably hardy. And by the way, Patty is drinking the pond. That's why the water level's gone down, Patty. If you've got fish in your pond, you may want to put pea shingle or gravel over the top of the soil. They have a tendency to burrow down into the soil on aquatic pots, and that can disturb the roots. I have to say that I find the wildlife in this garden to be just as rewarding as the plants. And we've had a film from Thomas Bloomer, who was forced, like all of us, to spend more time in his garden and started to notice more and more of the wildlife, and was astonished to find the sheer quantity of different species that he was sharing his garden with.
Hello, I'm Thomas, and welcome to my garden here in Redhill, Surrey. We've been working on the garden for about 30 years now, so all my life and a bit. Come and have a look. It's a long, narrow garden divided into different areas, all linked by an accessible paved path, which allows me to explore the whole garden all year round. This is our haven, and at the moment our world, as I'm shielding and can't leave the house. Coming out each day and spotting changes and growth has kept me going. I love wildlife and photography, and have found endless inspiration even in this relatively small space. The heart of everything we do in the garden is a combination of creating a space to encourage as much wildlife as possible, but at the same time it has to always be beautiful to look at. During the lockdown, we decided to do a list of all the wildlife we could see around and from the garden. We've now got to an amazing 215 species of creatures. And for the foreseeable future, this will continue to be my sanctuary and oasis. I look forward to each day discovering something new. And it will keep me going and continue to keep me going. Bye.
Well, Thomas, thank you very much for sharing your garden. I'm still just reeling at the number of species that you saw. And I would say that we have loved all the films that everybody has been sending in. So please don't stop. Send us in your films. Share your gardens and what you're up to, your tips, your hints, maybe even your failures. Just keep sending them. They're fabulous. Now, a little tip. that I have here are these red drumhead cabbages that I sowed into plugs a few weeks ago. And most of them have germinated. But now that they are growing and growing away fairly strongly, it's really important, if you're growing in plugs like this, to thin them out just to one strong plant per plug. You really do need to give each seedling a maximum chance to grow strongly. And obviously you need to hold down the base of the one you want to keep, because there's a risk that they all might come out in one go. Right, I will continue this job steadily until it's done. But here are some jobs for you to do this weekend. Shallots tend to ripen sooner than onions, and when you see the top growth has died right back, it's time to lift them. Don't yank them out of the ground, but carefully ease them out from the soil with a fork, and this will preserve the basal plate, which means they will store much longer. Let them dry off completely, and then they can be kept in a basket for months and months. I think no summer fruit is better than a delicious raspberry, but they don't ripen at the same time. So it's important to go through them every few days, harvesting those that are ready rather than waiting for them all to ripen together. At this time of year, some pots completely dry out, and when you try and water them, it just bounces off the surface. So fill a shallow container with water and stand the pots in overnight. They will absorb enough moisture so that thereafter you can water them normally from above. The Jewel Garden rises to its first crescendo at the end of May with the alliums and the tulips, but then it dies back, and quite frankly in June is a bit of a lull. But now we've reached July, the colours are really starting to build back in. And we have the marvellous magenta of the geranium and folkard that will go on flowering and rambling through the plants around it for the rest of summer. There is the rose William Shakespeare that is so prolific with that rich burgundy. And all around, the clematis are breaking out into deep purples. Now, to counterbalance that, we have the oranges. They're yet to really hit their stride, but you can see the Nymphofia is flaring orange, and it won't be long before the Tithonia and the sunflowers and Rebecchias create that lovely, rich jangle and tangle of colour. Well, that is to come, but I'm afraid we've run out of time for today. But I will see you back here at Longmeadow at 8 o'clock next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.